Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Kezcast. Today I'm joined by a fellow Year 12
Nilay sir.
and 2 Year 10s,
Joesph
and Seb Stephen.
and we're going to be talking about where meaning in literature actually comes from. It's going to be quite a laid-back discussion.
But it's a deep one, isn't it?
It's a deep
really
one.
philosophical, I think, at the same time.
It is. I think I have to agree with you there. And we're going to start off, as all good podcasts should, with a discussion about a meme. Now, this meme has been around for many a year now, ever since Miss Barton herself as a teenager, when Facebook began in the prehistoric age, and it's all about where meaning in literature comes from. And we start with a quote. The quote is, "The curtains were blue." Now, the English teacher sees that and thinks, the blue represents the sadness, the sorrow and depression within the room and within the character that occupies the room, whereas the author simply means the curtains were blue. However, is there more to it than that? Where does meaning in literature as we read come from? And I'm going to throw that out on the table for anyone to just chip in and make a contribution.
Well, I think the author obviously does have intentions on what he wants the reader to think when he writes it.
Yep.
However, it's more about how the reader gets that from the text.
Mhm.
So I think Susan Sontag talked about how it's more about the emotions which you can draw from the text and how the writer has used language to show those. So it's less about the intentions of the author, but how we perceive that and the language used to create the effect that it does.
That's a good point, actually, because if you think about it, the way books are written, there are so many different interpretations for one bit of text that you can make the argument, so why does it matter if there are so many things to interpret? However, the fact that there are that many things, or like that many ideas that you can perceive from a text, surely that in itself has meaning where you can sort of take the text and make it your own, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
because the writer, when they're writing, I don't think they're necessarily giving meaning. I think they're giving an expression, their own opinion, on a collective meaning that many people can relate to, understand. And other people interpret it on different layers. So one person described writing, I think it was in Barthes' The Death of an Author, as writing like a tissue, a piece of tissue. It's got so many layers to it. And the layers we choose to feel or use in response to our emotion is a layer of meaning that we relate to. So meaning is much, much, much more global than simply one individual viewpoint.
I think also for a book or text to remain relevant in different places and different times, the reader needs to be able to infer, their own meaning and not be forced to perhaps go on the social context or political context or whatever of when the writer originally wrote it.
I see. So I'm going to take that idea of being able to be interpreted in different times, and I'm going to reference an essay written by T.S. Eliot called Tradition and the Individual Talent, where T.S. Eliot, talking about poetry specifically, not just literature as a whole, but I think the ideas can be applied to literature as a whole, definitely poetry specifically, where he talks about this idea of tradition and what impact that may have on where meaning in text comes from. He says, literary tradition is important if it's more than just following what was successful in the previous generation. So it's taking what's been successful and then adding to it. There's this sort of sense of the timelessness and the temporal sense of English, and then combining them both together is what fundamentally makes tradition. What do you think about that?
So you're saying time is interconnected with the literature?
Time is interconnected with tradition, which in that case then the poet would take the tradition, add something of their own to it, and then make it their own, and then that's how tradition continues.
Wow, it reminds me, like, this evolution of meaning reminds me of the old ways folk violinists used to pass their music along each time.
Mm.
And so someone probably in the 1500s came up with a tune. They'd pass that to their grandchildren who'd maybe have a slight poor memory of it.
Yeah.
They tweaked a bit, and then they passed it on to their grandchildren.
Mm.
And slowly the music evolved organically.
Mm.
And I think that it's a bit like that with meaning. We take one idea that we read from the author and we spin that to our own feeling and our own virtue. And so meaning is not stuck, it's constantly in flux,
Yeah.
moving from one person to the other.
In a similar sense, I read an article doing classics at GCSE. I read an article about 2 years ago on whether you could say that sort of classical prose and poetry that was designed to be, you know, read by a town crier, or whatever, well, not a town crier, but the ancient equivalent of one like that, is this kind of that tradition in the sense of someone taking this text, reading it, and making it their own, and then making a connection with jazz, the music form,
Wow.
where you'll take certain standards or certain ideas within a jazz song and then reinterpret it the way you want to interpret it, and then put that out as your own kind of interpretation of it. So they're quite similar points with the folk violin, you know, the tune changing slightly over time.
And that link to jazz.
Yeah, that link to jazz, and then that link back to literature in the first place.
Wow.
With this prose that people like Homer or Tacitus were putting out, you know, back when literature pretty much began. So
I have one question for you guys, right?
Go.
So we're all saying that the reader's response to the writing is what activates meaning. But if there's no author in the first place, how can we get meaning from text in the first place? Surely there must be a need for an author in creating meaning of some sort in literature. Otherwise, how do we deepen our understanding?
Where would we get literature without an author from?
Yeah.
If the point you're making is that we need an author
To create
to
meaning.
create
I'm just playing the
meaning.
devil here.
Oh,
But
I
if
see,
if we don't have an author, where would the meaning come from? That's what I'm trying to ask.
I think
What's the author's job?
What is the
author's
author's
role?
job? Yeah.
What does he do?
I think the author's role is taking their idea of a book to be written, interpreting that in their own way, and then through that interpretation and putting their own interpretation out there, they're also kind of repeating the cycle of having this influence, maybe. Okay, say the author's been influenced by something. So you've got these kind of layers where there's influence, the original author, and then the original author giving their influence and sources away through their own interpretation of the original influence, if that makes sense. So you've kind of got these three layers of influence, author,
Wow.
influence again. And then it's kind of like this cake that just keeps on going, because it may not even be an author, it may just be someone reading this text who then takes their interpretation and is able to make it their own. And I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it, actually, because it's kind of like this cake of literature where it's source, author, source, maybe a reader who talked to someone else who then had their own idea, and yada, 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 and it just kind of branches out in that sense.
I think that the author is important in that he or she provides structure.
2019.
Structure for the
Almost
reader,
2020 now.
structure for the reader to base their interpretations upon, and without that original structure,
Yeah, exactly.
we couldn't then infer anything from it. And I think Wolfgang Iser gave an example in his text about the example of a constellation and how two people can look at it and see different images in it, but you need the stars and the structure of the stars there in the first place for them actually to infer anything at all. And it's about the relationship between the viewer and the structure that's already there that provides the interpretation that you can go from.
Symbiotic is biactive.
What about if it's up to the reader? Can't a text just mean anything? Isn't that an issue? How would you debate that? Can't it just be anything? How can we ever grade a literature essay? How can I, as a teacher, ever say one interpretation is better than the other one? Can you be wrong?
I think in that sense, while there are no interpretations that are necessarily wrong, especially if
Really?
you're writing.
You do
Well,
read some
well,
essays.
no. I'm making that. If that's I know that's a huge thing to say. If there are no interpretations that are necessarily wrong, however, I'm just gonna leave that there for a minute. Leave that on the table. On one side, if you've got an essay to mark as a teacher, it's not whether the ideas are wrong necessarily. It's more about how those ideas are put forward and the way they're argued, and the way just the way those ideas are vocalized, I think.
Yeah.
But if we go down the route of not all interpretations being correct, then you can say, perhaps, in the virtue of the words on the page, whether that interpretation could be seen to be right or wrong. Because if some author wrote a book saying, oh yeah, the curtains are blue, and I then interpret that to mean, oh yeah, but the curtains are red, unless there's some kind of external context where everything in the book is opposite, I don't know, in which case it wouldn't even be curtains, there'd be something else, it would be this other colour than blue.
The rugs on the floor. Yeah.
Exactly, the rugs on the floor are red. Then, in the virtue of the meaning of the words, that is where the interpretation comes from, and I think only in that sense can we say that an interpretation is right or wrong.
Okay.
I think.
Language and structure kind of provide a base to go off. Without that base, you start with nothing.
So they're the stars.
Yeah, it's like that. Because if you look at the way people view a book, most people will see it in a very similar way. There may be different interpretations, but they will still have like a similar viewpoint on the same thing, which shows there must be a starting point. Because if every single person could look at the same thing and see something completely different, then that will show that it's completely based on the reader. But as people are coming to a conjoined viewpoint, it shows that there is something to start off with that inspires this context in the reader's mind.
Super.
That's a great point.
That is an excellent point.
That's so wonderful. And the thing is, what Miss Barton was also saying about was when she marks different people's essays, the thing is, what I'd argue is, actually what she's marking aren't the people's viewpoint. I'd say it's a flawed, corrupted, impure viewpoint. Because what she's doing when she's teaching is she's presenting her argument there. But I know it sounds terrible, she's polluting this purity of the reader. And she's already putting preconceived notions on the reader. And as a result, they see literature through that singular prism. They are limited and obscured to the wider scope that literature offers to a reader. And so, as C.S. Eliot, what C.S. Lewis said was, we must read the book in isolation to see it in its purest meaning. And I think that's...
So is that how we should teach literature? You should read it all on your own.
And then we discuss
and then
it.
we'll come back to it.
And then we debate interpretation.
Surely the discussion itself will pollute their opinion of it, and for to have a pure interpretation.
Because we've had quite a few metaphors, haven't we? We've had.
Can I just quickly say, I think Seb, you need to leave.
Seb needs to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Right, thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Anyway,
So
keep going, miss.
if we have these different metaphors, so we talked about the constellations.
Yeah.
We've talked about this idea of pollution. Is pollution the right one? Is it not cross-fertilisation of ideas? And we've also talked about preconceptions. And we've talked about preconceptions that you might get in the classroom. But what do you bring to the classroom? Aren't
Your
these all
own
extra
ideas.
ideas which might be
Yeah, I
polluting,
think
cross-fertilising our interpretations?
I think pollution necessarily, and all the imagery that pollution connotes, is. I don't think that's necessarily the right way of looking at a discussion about a book. I think definitely, well, even in the virtue of the meaning of cross-fertilisation, where you're able to take your own ideas, bounce them off someone else, and then all that kind of... I think you could argue that whenever an essay, or like a GCSE essay or an A-level essay is written about a text, that is... It's their own interpretation, but in that sense, that is also a work of art, because it's continuing the tradition of taking the literature that's been written, interpreting it your own way, articulating your points and putting your points out there, for then the marker to read and think, okay, that's been articulated well, okay, that's been articulated poorly, yada, yada, yada. In that sense, that's kind of irrelevant, where the most important thing and where the meaning comes from is your own interpretation of that text, if that makes sense.
Definitely, yeah.
And that's what we work towards in class as well, because we start off with, perhaps not being, hopefully, as quite as dictatorial as Nilay has made out. But by the end, that's what you're doing, isn't it? That by the end you are, hopefully by the end of your GCs, you are confident enough to actually rely on your own reader responses. But often the easy way out seems to be to say, oh, well, maybe the author only meant this. So that's actually the hardest thing. It sounds the easiest thing, doesn't it? It just means what the reader wants it to. But maybe by the end, the most difficult thing is trusting and articulating.
Yeah, it's deciding what you actually think it means.
Yeah,
and then articulating that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, actually.
Super.
Oh. Right, I think that's all the time we have this week. That was really interesting, actually, guys. Thank you very much for coming.
Nice.
And yeah, we'll see you in a bit.